Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs, from preschool through higher education, and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program continues our conversation with Susan Katz, Professor Emeritus of International and Multicultural Education at the University of San Francisco. In this episode, she discusses her publications in the field of human rights education, her scholarship on the rights of indigenous peoples and how it has shaped her work in human rights education, the relationship between social justice and human rights education, how human rights education can address violations of human rights in the United States, notably those affecting children, her recommendations for advancing human rights education in the U.S. and globally, who she considers influential role models for her work, and what she considers the most important change that would advance human rights education in the United States. So let's turn to your book with Andrea Sparrow.
Okay.
That was really, I think, a very significant publication in the field.
Thank you.
Can you talk about what you feel the impact of that has been, and specifically on the work of the people whose work was in the book?
Yeah. Yes, I think, I don't know, I hope that it's had an impact. I mean, the intention was, as you know, to provide pedagogical models. So, 10 chapters were pedagogical models. My intention was to really publish the students' work, not just as a model for others, but for their own benefit to have a publication. And I think that's been significant. I'd say the majority of the authors now have faculty positions, some at USF, some at other California universities. I don't think that publication, was the make or break it, but it certainly helped them have a record of scholarship. I think that, some of those examples were from very early years of the human rights education class. I always wished I could publish sequels, because so many of the projects that the students have done since have just been so phenomenal. But I think that it led the authors to reflect that, because initially it was just their final project for the class, hypothetical, and then we chose the examples from that of people who actually had implemented them and then reflected on that. So I think that was really important. I think that the fact that the book includes examples of bringing human rights, for example, into a science class and also into early years. Though I know that many people feel human rights is inappropriate at primary level. And so we were trying to show that that's not true. We have examples from primary grades, examples of secondary, and examples of university. So to show that it's possible. So hopefully, it's hard for me to know exactly what the impact has been. One problem I felt, which not true of your book, is the fact that when it first came out, it was so expensive as an academic book, and I would do that differently next time around. And so I was just creating PDFs of all the chapters and circulating them. So it's hard for me to know what the impact has really been, but that's a regret that I have. It was very difficult for me to promote that book. It was $100 when it first came out, but they had said they were going to release it in paperback very quickly, but that took several years. So yeah. Um, but I'm thrilled that you feel that it's been important in the field of human rights education. Yeah.
Oh, I know. I've used it in my own teaching, and
Wonderful.
I think that the power of it is that people reflect on what actually happened. It's not just that they
Yes.
presented a lesson;
Yes.
they actually talked about the impact,
Exactly.
and they had evidence from the
Yes.
students. And that those types of artifacts, I think, are very powerful and authentic, you know.
Yes, exactly. And that's why I said, like, we specifically chose, the ones where people have actually implemented. The other impact, I think, I love Wayne Yang's Afterward. And I know that that chapter has been used in many education classes. So I'm excited about that, just raising the question of, can human rights be decolonized, colonizing? Yeah. So
So
I think that's had an impact.
yeah, I want to turn back to something you said before
Uh-huh.
about social
Sure.
justice, because
Hmm.
there's been a lot of discussion and conversation about the relationship between social justice and human rights education. Um, how do you actually conceptualize the relationship?
Well, first of all, I think they are integral to each other. And I think I love the art, the work that Carl Gran and Melissa Gibson have done of calling them twin siblings, I think, and how looking at how dangerous it is to separate. And I think the way it's conceived is kind of social justice focuses on issues in the US and human rights is outside the US. And so I know we agree in this, in that the challenge has been to bring human rights framework to looking at issues in the US. I mean, to look at criminal injustice in the US and to look at racism in the US from a human rights perspective. So, and to make the connections between what's happening here and what's happening globally. And Malcolm X made that connection way back. And I know Carol Anderson's book, Eyes Off the Prize, really talks about historically why that happened. So the US exceptionalism has made it so difficult for people in this country to have a human rights perspective. So I think that it's it's a false dichotomy to say social justice relates here and human rights relates everywhere but here. So I think that what social justice framework can bring, though, is focusing on economic and class social economic and social class realities and looking at that, which I think human rights sometimes framework can not ignore, but not prioritize sufficiently. And again, that's because of the whole history of how that's been split in the US. But the fact of the US not ratifying Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Convention of Economic Covenant Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, but just the the difficulty to focus on class. So social justice frame often provides a lens to do that. But I don't think in teaching human rights and teaching human rights education, I know at USF, we've always tried to focus on social and economic and cultural issues, like looking and when right around COVID, I was looking at housing as a human right, looking at healthcare as a human right. I think that recently, since the Occupy movement, I think there's been more of a focus on that within human rights to look at issues, economic issues, and to look within the US. But I think for a long time that has been too split. So I don't know if I hope that helps to answer. I see them as integral. And I
Well,
think
yeah,
it's
and
unfortunate.
I think most people do in our field.
Yeah,
Bernie
yeah,
Sanders, I think, really was the
yes,
one who brought
yes,
that issue front and center, right? Healthcare is a human right.
absolutely. Yes,
But it's hard to find very many leading politicians even talking about it that way.
Yes,
So I think
yes,
we owe him a lot of credit for actually putting that in front of the public square.
absolutely. Absolutely. I'm a huge Bernie fan, largely for those reasons because it's been really ignored here. Yeah. Yeah.
And,
And
and one of the
yeah,
other things that you mentioned was this idea that of American exceptionalism, which a lot of scholars have talked about, and in a sense, I think related that back to the idea of U.S., for lack of a better term, hegemony after the Second World War.
exactly.
Um, and I'm wondering what you think about whether American exceptionalism is still as powerful as it was.
Well, how I've often taught about US exceptionalism is the US being so critical of human rights violations in other countries and refusing to address that within the US. It's a reason why back, maybe it was 2006, I met people from the US Human Rights Network, US Human Rights, yeah, USHRN. I met at a conference, human rights conference in France. I was trying to learn everything I could about human rights before piloting that class. And I've often used their work in my teaching of human rights to say, look at how these issues, let's look inside what's happening in this country around race, around criminal justice, around poverty from a human rights lens. And so I think that that has really helped. However, I still think predominantly in the US, people think of human rights, are again very critical of every other country, but not looking inside. I think that starting with, now it's the anniversary of the killing of Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin before that, but looking at police violence and criminal injustice, I think, and Michael Brown and George Floyd's family taking cases to the UN. I think that has, helped in some of this. So I think there is a recognition that wow, certainly in the last 10 years, of that the US is responsible for human rights violations right within our own backyard. However, I still think I still think there's the US exceptionalism is still at play of thinking somehow where the human rights framework is foreign. I mean, look at the Convention of the Rights of the Child. Why that we're the only country in the world to not have ratified that. And I remember when Barack Obama was inaugurated, I remember being in my class, we were listening to his inauguration speech, and he mentioned that was a priority. And, all that. So I think there's still a tendency to think that the human rights framework, we have the US Constitution, we have our laws, that it's somehow foreign or and then again, I mean, I think it depends on who you're talking about, because you mentioned in the questions about the polarization that we're experiencing here, as well as so many countries, extreme polarization. So I'd say there is certainly half the population in the US who does feel like the human rights framework applies. And then there's half that says, no, 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 we're not going to let some foreign power tell us what to do. Um, so I think this past year, with regard to Israel and Palestine, has been really interesting. With the role that the UN organs like the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court have been more, I guess, in the news or taking action. And so I think that there's probably a growing awareness of what the UN can and cannot do.
Well, it's
Um,
interesting you mentioned that because my sense of it is that until we have human rights in the daily conversation,
Right,
on the pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post, it's one thing, but
right.
it's got to be on the Austin Statesman and it's got to be in the other
Yes.
newspapers as well
Uh-huh.
and on internet. Then I think we'll have more of a conversation about it when they use the words, because many
Exactly.
journalists don't even use the words.
No, no,
So let me shift
absolutely.
over to another topic, because you had mentioned many of the issues that we're facing in this country in your last response, but I'd like you to think about one issue you are particularly passionate about, dealing with human rights education, and how would you actually deploy human rights education to deal with a violation, whether it's academic freedom or housing or poverty? How would you go about that?
Well, going back to the children's rights, for example. Um, I think that I would like to see it. And looking at your questions, it made me think, because I plan to be active in the presidential election. I am active, but I plan to, accelerate that now that we have Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. And I think that one of the things I would like to bring up, if I have any access, or just, hopefully after the election, is ratifying the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And I think I don't I how many people in this country are aware that we're the only country in the world that has not ratified it? I mean, people do not aware of that. What does that mean? So I'm very heartened by Tim Walz, what he's done, or he's at least initiated or supported in Minnesota, of just something so basic as free breakfast and lunch for children, for all children. So I'd say poverty and children's rights is something that I think that we could take action on, based on a human rights framework. And interestingly, I'd mentioned earlier about the Black Panther Party. It was the Black Panther Party that started free breakfast programs, and very basic community issues, taking control of that. I have to mention, I'm really proud because my cousin's son, who's a teacher in Virginia, during COVID, found that a lot of his students couldn't afford lunch. And so he used his COVID stimulus check to pay for school lunches. And it's led to a broader movement in Virginia. And so I think that is so basic, but connecting food, nutrition, daily needs with ability to learn. And then and that if we ratified the Convention of the Rights of the Child, I think it would cause people to really take stock of what that means and how we can take action for that. So that's a thought.
That's an interesting idea too, because the convention is so comprehensive,
Right.
it would deal with things as a holistic approach rather than saying, well, we have to solve this one thing, then we have to solve. No, we can actually approach
Mhm.
them all if we look at the child as a concept, right? As the whole human being.
Yes. Yes. So it really made me, I think it would be important for all of us who are involved in human rights education to bring that up as an issue with, the new administration, or, hopefully, hopefully we'll have an administration that's, I mean, I think so much this election, so much is at stake in terms of human rights and the future of what human rights. It's not just in this country, but the rest of the world, because I know that everyone I know outside of the US is just as concerned about the results of this election as we are inside this country. The impact is just huge. But just think about human rights, so much is at stake.
Well, you lead into my next question, which is
Okay.
the development of authoritarianism.
Mm-hmm.
There's a rising tide of it. There's no question. I mean, you have people like Maduro and Viktor Orban and Vladimir Putin, but we
Mm-hmm.
also have authoritarian elements at the head of the Republican Party in this country.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, how would you deploy human rights education to address some of those threats that they pose?
That's very interesting because do you follow Heather Cox Richardson?
Yes.
And I think this was in a Facebook chat. I'm not sure if she wrote about this, but she said one of the key tactics or tools against authoritarianism is joy. And if people are feeling joyful and, about their lives, about hopes, and, are not going to be so easily succumb to authoritarianism. I never really thought about that, but I think in human rights education, I love Bill Simmons' book, Joyful Human Rights, and brought that into my teaching too, of how human rights education can be also taught or carried out with it, not only a focus on suffering, but a focus on joy. And so I think that's really important because that, I know in early years or people just when you're you're only focusing and teaching about violation after violation after violation, it's depressing, it's overwhelming, but how to integrate joy into human rights education is the first step in fighting authoritarianism. Um, but oh boy, I think that the human rights framework is really designed to empower people. And if people are empowered and also with a critical understanding of current realities, authoritarianism cannot thrive. But oh boy, as you know, to bring human rights education into teacher education is no overall. I was just I was in Colombia, South America, and I also was in British Columbia recently and found out that all of Canada, there's a mandate to integrate truth and reconciliation with First Nations people into the curriculum and pedagogy mandate. Now, we know a mandate doesn't necessarily solve everything, but that's an important step. At least it's a motivation. And, if only human rights education could be mandated. Again,
That's,
yeah.
a number of people who we've spoken to on the podcast have mentioned that. And actually, Glenn Matoma, whose episodes were just published in
Yes.
August of this year, he pointed out he felt the most important thing that could happen would be to have a national commission on on truth and reconciliation about the genocide against indigenous peoples in the United States.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it's happened in Canada. Yes.
So I think
Yes. I agree.
it would be an interesting, I think, earth-shaking development if people had the courage to do it. So let me turn to our last few questions here.
Okay.
And again, these are
Oh,
common for every podcast
right.
person we have on. So, who would be the most influential role model for your work in human rights education today, or who has passed on?
Right, right. Well, interestingly, I mean, I barely know her, but I would say um Ericka Huggins because of influence on me because of um what I became. She was a model for me in my college years. And then the work she did in starting and directing the Black Panther Party School, the Oakland Community School, and then the work that she's done since then. Um, Interestingly, I don't know, like, uh, are you familiar with the issue that Monisha and I worked on, co-edited on Black liberation and human rights education?
Mhm.
Yeah, because a former student, not before we had the human rights program, but a former master's student in our department, lent her the wall of her home in West Oakland for the mural of women of the Black Panther Party, and Ericka Huggins was really involved in that. So, I mean, she's not, she may not be known as a human rights educator, but she is. And I think the impact she had on me as a college student all throughout. We wanted her to write the foreword for our book, and she unfortunately had some family issues at the time. But so she has this quote. I know you were asking for a quote, and she says, "Love is an expression of power. We can use it to change the world." The other person I would mention did write the foreword for our book is Olga Talamonte, who I've known since 1976, when she was a political prisoner and jailed in Argentina. And I'd say she's an inspiration to me as a human rights educator, because she left that situation not very determined to have her experience be a lesson for others. And then when around the time, I think she was a speaker in the very first class, so around 2007, when what was coming out in the US in terms of the practice of torture, she started speaking up about her own experiences of being tortured in jail in Argentina. But then directing the Chicana Latina Foundation, the pedagogical model that they've used is for students to share their stories as a way of empowerment. And that organization has done phenomenal work. So I would see her as someone who's had a big impact on me as a human rights educator, even though she hasn't worked in K-12 schools. Yeah.
So is there one other quote you want to bring forward? You
Yes.
already mentioned one. Do you have
Yes,
any other?
I love, well, Olga Talamonte back then in 1976, I remember having this poster where she said, "Love life enough to struggle." I love that one. But I also love what Loretta Ross has said. She's another person I would say is as a model, as a human rights educator, but she talks about this chain of freedom. And she says, the chain of freedom stretches back toward your ancestors and forward towards your descendants. Let's see, I have this written down, so I have to open this a sec. Sorry. Your job today is to make sure the chain doesn't break at your link. That's all you need to focus on, not letting the chain break at your link. So I've used that as an inspiration to my students. That's your responsibility. You have as an active, conscious citizen, non-citizen, but a human rights player. Don't let the chain break at your link.
And so for our final question, if you had the power to make one critical change to advance human rights education in the US, what would you recommend?
I think that if I had the power, I would mandate, like we were saying, with the understanding that there's a lot of space and openness for people to make it their own and embrace it, not top down. So I would mandate human rights education throughout K-12 curriculum and in teacher education programs. Because I think that, and I've seen not just in the US, but in the work I've done with others in institutes where there have been people from other countries, and looking at some of the challenges across the globe, it seems like teacher education is the missing piece. If teachers are not comfortable with the whole conception of human rights, do not understand the framework, are not given support to be able to develop understanding of human rights education, a mandate's not going to work. So all of that, yes.
Okay, well, this has been a fascinating conversation, Susan, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for asking me. I appreciate the opportunity to reflect.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Pocket Casts, Player FM, and Deezer. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy at hreusa.org. That's KRISTI at hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Rodelius Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Jessica Terbruggen, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.